I wake before the sun most mornings, not because I am eager to seize the day like the lifestyle magazines advise, but because the house won't let me sleep past 5. It shifts in size the way old bones do, as if the studs remember the weight of people who aren't here anymore. The pipes clack, the furnace grumbles, and my mind starts walking its familiar loop before my legs do. Down the hall, where the carpet is thin as a prayer, into the kitchen with the wobbly chair I keep meaning to fix, past the window that looks east toward the maple that has lost more branches these last 2 years than I like to count. I grind the coffee by hand because the electric grinder roars like a leaf blower, and it feels wrong to make that kind of noise in a house that prefers whispers. The kettle stutters, the newspaper thumps the steps, and I tell myself, as I do every morning, that this is still a life, not merely the ruins of one. I talk to Eleanor sometimes, which would make my daughter roll her eyes and tell her friends her father's slipping. But I don't care. I don't talk to the empty air as if it's answering me. I talk the way a man talks to the water when he casts a line, knowing it won't reply, but needing to say the words anyway. Eleanor was the one who taught me how to make coffee with a pinch of salt, to take the bitterness down to something you could carry without grimacing. I keep a little jar of sea salt near the kettle, and I pretend that doing it her way invites her back for the length of a cup. It's foolish, and it helps. By 8, I have swallowed my pills, traced the crossword like a map of places I used to know by heart, and checked the porch camera to see whether the mail carrier parked crookedly again. I do not like the camera, but Sam from the VFW convinced me to install it after what happened on Oak Street last fall, when a man in a neon vest pretended to be a city inspector and cleaned out old Mrs. Kerr's jewelry box while she made him lemonade. Now the doorbell tells me everything I could do without knowing. A raccoon at 2:17 a.m., a catalog no one ordered at 5:42, a bundle of fake charity flyers wedged under the doormat, and, some afternoons, a lanky boy who cuts across my lawn instead of using the sidewalk like his grandparents taught him. He used to slow down when he reached my steps and tilt his head toward the door, as if he were deciding whether to knock. The first time, I opened it before he made up his mind. "You looking for someone?" I asked, and he wandered up with that half-smile boys grow when they are equal parts charm and trouble. "Maybe I'm looking for you, Grandpa," he said. And there it was again, the word that is supposed to feel like an anchor and lately feels like a hook. His name is Justin, 19 in August, my only grandson. A boy I once bounced on my knee in flannel pajamas, with trains on them. A boy who started calling me G when he was 12 and decided 2-syllable words were for the weak. Now he has a buzz cut. He did himself in a bathroom mirror and a pair of sneakers that could rent a 1-bedroom for the price he paid. And when he hugs me, his chest stays an inch away from mine, as if we were both made of glass. On good days, with the good stories, I could tell you our family simply drifted, the way families do when grown children plant themselves in different soil and forget the flavor of the old harvest. The truer story is pettier and duller. 100 cuts so small we could call them misunderstandings, and a few that bled enough to stain holidays. My son, Daniel, is Justin's father, and Daniel has been long distance and late for as long as I can remember. Not a villain. Just a man who learned early that work would not interrupt him if he didn't let it. He loved his boy, but love does not make baseball games on a Wednesday at 5:30. And love does not change the way a 12-year-old keeps track of who shows and who doesn't. After Eleanor's service, small, kind, mostly casseroles and stories, Daniel took to calling me on Sundays to make sure I was eating real food and not canned soup every night. And after a while, the calls thinned to texts with thumbs-up emojis and links to articles about aging in place that made me want to fling my flip phone into the bird bath. He meant well, and he was tired, and I told myself I needed less than I wanted. Justin filled the space Daniel left, at first because his mother asked him to, then because he learned I would always answer the door and always ask whether he was hungry. We watched ball games, little clips he found online, and videos of men building cabins in the woods with only hand tools. And when he laughed, his shoulder leaned into mine, just a fraction, and I let the ache that came with that happen without telling it to stop. He had a gift for lying with a grin that made you forgive the lie before you spotted it, and he had a way of calling me my man that made me feel like a version of myself I could still admire. Money came up the way rain comes up in spring here, predicted, inevitable, and never quite the amount you prepared for. A 20 here for gas, a 50 there for textbooks that never appeared, 100 for team fees. I later discovered were not for any team I could name. I am not foolish. I am old, which is a different thing. I knew where the money was going because Justin's hands shook when he claimed they weren't, and because I have seen the way a boy looks through you when he is thinking about the next hour and nothing else. I told him I would help him with groceries and school and shoes, but not with the kind of favors that make a man start telling himself new stories about who he is. He nodded and swallowed and said he understood, and for a month he came over on Saturdays to help me clean the gutters and fix the hinge on the bedroom door that used to catch when Eleanor came in with her arms full of laundry. We ate grilled cheese, and he told me he was taking class at the community college on automotive basics, and I told him about the Ford I rebuilt the summer before I shipped out. And for 2 hours we were a pair of men with grease on our knuckles and a future we could describe without choking on it. Then he stopped coming, and I stopped asking where he'd been, because at my age, dignity is the difference between a life and a beggar's bowl. I keep my accounts the way an old carpenter keeps his tools, boxed, labeled, and within reach. It amuses people to find out I still balance a checkbook with a pen and a ruler, drawing straight lines so I'll see where mine end and the bank's begin. But the habit has saved me more than once. After a charity that wasn't a charity tried to auto-draft 3 times in a week, the bank manager, a woman with a soft voice and a spine like rebar, sat me down in her office and helped me set short daily limits on the debit card I keep in a drawer and a note on the savings account that sends someone in a uniform my way if unusual activity wakes it up. She insisted on 2-step verification for the banking app my daughter forced me to install. Dad, it's 2025. You can't live like it's 1998. And made me promise I would never give a code over the phone to anyone, not even her. I left that meeting feeling both protected and insulted, which is how this stage of life often feels. People guarding you from the world, while the world tries to sell you a chair that claims it can stand up for you. I told Daniel about the safeguards, and he said he was proud of me in the tone a parent uses when you finally learn how to set your thermostat. And I let him have that, because his pride costs me nothing, and giving it to him stops the conversation from turning toward the places that hurt us both. It is strange how houses remember what hands have done in them. My stairs know the rhythm of Eleanor's feet, quick and sure, and they know the careful shuffle of mine, the pause on the 5th step where the railing wobbles. I wrapped the loose bracket with cloth so it wouldn't scratch the varnish, a temporary fix that became permanent the way bandages do when the wound closes around them. Some afternoons I stand at the top and look down the narrow chute of carpeting, thinking of the way gravity treats an old body, calculating angles the way a man in my line of work once calculated quarterly projections. It is not morbid, it is practical. You think of these things because you must. because the floor seems farther away each year and you refuse to surrender to it without at least having measured the distance. My doctor says the bones in my wrist are a little like chalk now, and I joked that I will write my name in the air by accident if I fall. He did not laugh. I bought better slippers, threw rugs with wicked corners into a pile for goodwill, and promised the nurse I would stop carrying laundry down the stairs, like I was still 45. When Justin does come by now, he texts from the sidewalk instead of ringing the bell, as if the threshold were a border crossing and we needed papers in order. "You home, G?" he writes, and I answer, "Door's open." And he pushes it with his foot like he expects it to bite. He takes in the place with a glance, the way a boy trained by a jittery life does, and his eyes always land on the bowl where I keep my keys and the little leather card pouch Eleanor gave me on our 40th anniversary. He notices things I didn't teach him to notice. Whether the safe in the closet is locked, whether the phone charger is plugged in, whether the porch light is on at noon. He asks if I need anything from the store, if I have cash, if I've eaten, if I have any scratch-off tickets he can check, because my eyes are old man blind, and his are eagle. And I tell him I can see fine, and he laughs like we're still the pair we were the summer of the gutters. He has a new smell lately, not cologne, not sweat either, something chemical and sweet that clings to his hoodie. He talks faster and interrupts himself, looping back to the start of a sentence like a fishing line snagged on a submerged rock. And I nod and drink my coffee and set the mug down carefully, because the mug is one of the last of the set Eleanor liked. White with a blue ring. And I intend to outlast it, so the house will have to find some other way to measure time. I am not naive. I have lived long enough to know that love arrives wearing many kinds of faces, and desperation wears them all. I watch my grandson watching me, and I tally the invisible math that governs every visit. How quickly he asks about money this time, how many sentences pass before the word help, how much eye contact he can handle before he looks at the floor. I try to give him tasks that pay without feeling like payment. Flush the water heater, sweep out the garage, sort the old screws and nails into jars with labels he writes in a looping hand that would have gotten him a star from his first-grade teacher. And I tuck a 20 in his pocket after as if he hadn't noticed me planning it from the moment he crossed the threshold. He says thank you. He calls me a legend. He promises to come by Friday. And Friday arrives and goes, and I take the porch chair inside so the rain won't ruin it, and I tell myself the weather kept him, or traffic, or a girl. On nights when the wind finds the gaps around the windows and plays them like a harmonica, I picture him at a bus stop with his hood up, shivering, choosing between two doors he doesn't want to knock on. And I feel an old man's useless fury at a world that tells boys to be hard and then sells them softness in a small baggie at a price no one can pay. There are numbers that live in the head the way street names do, and my grandson knows some of mine by heart. The house number, my birthday, the last four of the social. He does not know the ones that matter, the codes that open things the world wants kept shut. Though once, half joking, half testing, he asked me whether I kept my bank pin the same as the alarm pin, and I told him no, and changed both that afternoon, because a joke is often a rehearsal in a family like ours. I have learned to answer questions with stories. When he asks, "How much you got set aside, G?" I tell him about the time Eleanor and I drove to Yellowstone, and she smuggled a salt shaker into the lodge because the soup was undersalted. And when he asks, "Do you keep any cash here, for emergencies?" I tell him about the winter the pipes burst and Eleanor held the light while I crawled under the house and cursed like a sailor, until the phrases made us both laugh so hard she had to sit on the workbench. He rolls his eyes and says I'm a vault, and I tell him yes, but the door is open to anyone who comes in kindness. He says that's corny, and I say yes. And he says, I love you, G, with the careless ease of a boy who believes love is a bottomless account in someone else's name. I don't tell him it isn't. I just refill the salt jar and measure out the coffee and wait for the house to decide whether today will be one of its quiet days or one of the days when it spits me back toward the world like a seed. It was the first truly cold night of November when the story changed its temperature. The kind of night when the air outside tastes metallic and the furnace has to prove itself after months of rest. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with a crossword, the overhead light buzzing like an old fly, when the doorbell rang at a strange hour. I thought it was a delivery mistake at first. No one decent comes knocking after 10 in our neighborhood. The door camera was dark because I had forgotten to charge it. So when I opened the door, all I saw was the shape of a boy in a hoodie, shoulders hunched, breath clouding like smoke. Then the light from the hall spilled across his face, and I saw the hollow cheeks and the twitch in his jaw that didn't belong to the grandson I remembered. Gee, thank God you're up, Justin said, pushing his way inside before I could answer. He smelled of cold, gasoline, and something else, something sour and desperate. His eyes moved everywhere at once, cataloging the house like a thief forced to work fast. I asked if he was in trouble. He said, kind of, but not like you think, and his voice broke on the last word. I told him to sit, to breathe, to tell me what was going on. He kept standing, pacing near the counter, rubbing his hands on his jeans as if to wipe off invisible dirt. I just need some money, okay? Not much. I'll pay you back, swear to God. I just need a little now. I wanted to believe him. I always wanted to believe him. I poured 2 cups of coffee, though I knew he wouldn't drink his, and set one in front of the empty chair. He looked at it like it might explode. I asked what the money was for. People, he said, not meeting my eyes. People who don't wait. You wouldn't understand. I told him I had helped him before, and I would help again if he would just tell me the truth. But lies breed fast when they sense weakness, and I could feel them already circling in the air between us. He started talking about tuition, about bills, about a friend who got him into something that went bad. His words came out tangled, like he was reading from a script written in panic. I told him the truth, that I didn't have much, that my accounts were nearly empty, except for a small savings I kept untouched, and that I couldn't just hand him cash without knowing what hole it would fall into. That was when the request changed shape. He said he didn't need cash, just the card and the code. 4 little numbers, he said. 4 seconds of my life that could fix everything. He was shaking now, not from cold, but from something deeper, and his pupils were wide and black like oil. I said no. I said it gently at first, then firmer when he kept insisting. He laughed, not the way people laugh when they're amused, but the way they do when they're cornered. You think I'm going to rob you, G? Come on, it's me. You don't trust your own blood? That sentence hit me harder than it should have. Blood used to mean something in our family. It was the thread that held us through the years when Daniel was too busy to call and Eleanor's health was slipping. It meant unspoken duty, Sunday dinners, the right to ask for help without shame. But standing there in my kitchen, the word felt like a weapon pointed the wrong way. I told him trust wasn't the issue, safety was. I reminded him of the scam calls, the fake inspectors, the woman down the block whose own nephew emptied her account. He winced as if I'd accused him directly. I'm not some junkie thief, he muttered, but the tone betrayed him. His hand went to his pocket again and again, fingers twitching. I thought maybe he had something there, a phone, a knife, I couldn't tell. and my chest tightened with the memory of every headline I'd read about home invasions gone wrong. I wanted to believe he wouldn't cross that line. I told him I'd call his father. Maybe he could help straighten this out. But Justin's face snapped into a mask I didn't recognize. "No calls," he said sharply. "Dad can't know. Please, G, don't make this worse." There are moments when you feel the air leave a room, even though you're still breathing it. He began to pace again, faster this time, muttering half-formed curses at people I didn't know. I tried to reason with him, said I could loan him 20 or 30 till the morning, that we could go to the bank together. He laughed again, only this time there was no sound, just a sharp exhale through his teeth. "I need more than that," he whispered. "You've got savings. I know you do. Mom said you were careful all your life. You can spare it. You're old. You don't even spend it." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were almost true. I had spent a lifetime being careful, putting away bits of security for a future that was already mostly behind me. Still, the money was my boundary, the last fence I had left between generosity and self-erasure. I told him no again, more firmly, and moved toward the door to show him out. That was when he reached out, not to hug me, not to stop me, but to grab the back of the chair beside him so hard the wood creaked. His knuckles were white, and there was something wild behind his eyes. "Don't treat me like a kid," he hissed. "You think I like asking? You think this is easy for me? I'm trying to fix things before they get worse." I asked what things, but he didn't answer. He stepped closer instead, lowering his voice to a tone I had never heard from him. "If you don't help me, they'll come here." I remember the sound of the clock ticking in that silence. I remember the hum of the refrigerator and the way the bulb above the sink flickered once, a tiny heartbeat of light. I said, "Who's they?" He said, "You don't want to know." For a second, I saw the boy he used to be flicker behind his face, the one who used to collect baseball cards and cry when his dog got sick. Then he was gone again, replaced by someone harder, someone older than 19 should look. I said I'd call the police if anyone threatened him, that we could handle this the right way. And he smiled, a sad, tired smile that made me think of Eleanor's words the week before she died. You can't save someone who's already started drowning. He backed away toward the stairs, muttering that he just needed to think, that he'd step outside for a smoke. I told him to stay where I could see him, but he was already halfway up, the hood shadowing his face. The next thing I remember is motion. The floor tilted under me, a rush of pain bloomed across my ribs, and then there was only the terrible sound of wood against bone. It wasn't a shove like in the movies. It was a short, violent nudge, a betrayal measured in inches. I saw his shoes at the top step, and then the ceiling spun. When I came to, the house was dark except for the hallway light, and my legs screamed when I tried to move. The coffee cups had shattered, one rolling lazily in a circle at the bottom of the stairs. I called his name, but the front door was open, letting the cold pour in. My phone lay on the floor a few feet away, cracked, the screen pulsing with missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. I managed to crawl to the couch and pull a blanket over myself, waiting for the pain to settle in something I could name. At some point, I must have passed out again, because the next light I saw was fluorescent and humming, and the next face was not Justin's, but a nurse's. She said a neighbor had called an ambulance, after noticing my door ajar and no lights on for hours. She said I was lucky nothing was broken worse than my wrist and a few ribs. I wanted to ask if anyone had seen my grandson, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I told her I had fallen. That was easier. Old men fall. That's what we do. It was only later, when the officer came by to take a routine report, that I realized how much had been taken. My wallet was gone. So was the small card pouch Eleanor had given me, the one with the debit card tucked inside. The officer said it was probably just a burglary of opportunity, maybe a drifter. I nodded, agreeing with a story I didn't believe. When he left, I asked for my phone. It was in a plastic bag on the bedside table, cracked but alive. I charged it long enough to open my banking app. The balance stared back at me, almost the same as before, $9 and some change. But the notification above it was new, a message from the bank's fraud alert system, time-stamped 3 hours after I'd been admitted. Someone had tried to withdraw money from my account at a gas station downtown. The attempt failed. The system had flagged it as suspicious because the account carried a police alert. I had almost forgotten about that, an extra layer the bank manager insisted on after the last scam attempt. Any unexpected withdrawal automatically triggered contact with law enforcement. I closed the app and stared at the ceiling, piecing together the timeline. Justin had taken the card, maybe believing there was a fortune waiting. He had tried the PIN, probably his birthday, maybe mine, maybe the house number. When that failed, he must have guessed something close enough to trip the security measures. Somewhere out there, as I lay under hospital lights, my grandson had discovered that his grandfather's fortune amounted to less than the cost of the sneakers on his feet, and that the card he stole had quietly summoned the police. The thought was almost funny, if not for the ache in my chest. I imagined his face when the machine refused him, the flicker of confusion giving way to anger, then fear. I imagined him realizing that he hadn't just robbed me. He had robbed himself of whatever love was left between us. When the nurse came back to check my vitals, she asked if I was in pain. I said yes, but not where she thought. They let me go home 2 days later, though the doctor insisted someone should stay with me for a week, and I nodded as if there were someone to ask. The wrist was wrapped, the ribs taped, and the painkillers dulled the world into a heavy, syrupy calm. The house smelled of cold air and dust when I stepped inside, the kind of smell you get when windows have been left open too long. A neighbor named Ruth had locked the front door after the police finished, and she left a note that said, "We were worried. Call if you need soup." I stood there a long time with that note in my hand, the handwriting small and careful, like the old letters Eleanor used to write, and I realized it had been years since anyone had written me something by hand. The carpet on the stairs still bore a faint smear where the coffee had spilled, a dried brown streak that looked like an old scar. I sat on the bottom step, touching the fibers as if to make sure it had happened, as if the fall might have been a morphine dream. The police had been by again that morning at the hospital, a younger officer this time, polite and efficient, asking if I had remembered anything new about the intruder. I told him again that I hadn't seen a face, just a shape. He nodded, jotting something down, already halfway out the door in his mind. They had real crimes to handle. An old man's fall in an unlocked house was paperwork, not a case. That evening I tried to make soup from a can, but dropped the opener twice before getting it right, and each time the sound echoed louder than it should have. I kept glancing at the door as if expecting someone to appear there, though I didn't know if I wanted it to be the police or the boy himself. I told myself that maybe Justin hadn't meant to hurt me, that the shove had been an accident, a moment of panic when he saw the door and his chance. But accidents don't take wallets. They don't leave you lying in the dark. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through my phone, replaying our last text thread. His final message before that night was from 2 weeks earlier. "You good G? Need anything from store?" And my answer had been, "Just company." He hadn't replied. I read it over and over, wondering how something so small could feel like a prophecy, Then, unable to stop myself, I opened the banking app again. The balance was still $9 and some cents. The fraud alert had been acknowledged by the authorities, it said, and a case number had been assigned. I tried to imagine the conversation at the station when they realized the suspect was my own grandson. If they knew yet, if they cared. Maybe they saw it as a family matter, a domestic slip. I almost preferred that. Let the world believe I was foolish rather than betrayed. 2 days later, a detective named Ferris came by, gray-haired but sharp-eyed, the kind of man who looked like he had seen too much but was still willing to see a little more. He asked if we could talk in the living room, and I led him there, careful with my steps. He didn't take notes at first, just watched the way I moved around the room, the cast on my wrist, the way my breath caught when I sat down. "Mr. Hollis," he said finally, "the attempt to withdraw money from your account was made at a gas station on 7th and Main. The cameras caught a clear image of the suspect. Does the name Justin Hollis mean anything to you?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. He had already seen the file. He knew the answer. I nodded slowly. "My grandson," I said. The detective didn't flinch, didn't soften his tone the way people do when they think pity is a kind of kindness. He asked when I'd last seen him. I said the night of the accident, that he'd come asking for money, that he'd been agitated. He wrote that down, his pen moving with quiet precision. When I finished, he sighed and closed the notebook. "We've issued a warrant," he said. "He's been picked up before. Petty theft, some vandalism. Nothing major, but it adds up." I asked what would happen now. "We'll talk to him," he said, which I knew meant we'll scare him a little and see if he talks. Before leaving, he paused at the door. "You should have someone stay with you," he said again, echoing the doctor. I told him I'd manage. He looked at me like he didn't believe that, but didn't have time to argue. After he left, the house felt smaller. I made tea, but forgot to drink it. The steam rose and vanished like a spirit escaping. Every sound startled me. The creak of the porch, the hum of the fridge, the soft complaint of the wind through the chimney. That night, I dreamed of Eleanor standing at the top of the stairs, her face blurred by shadow. She said nothing, only raised her hand, as if to stop me from climbing. When I woke, the room was full of dawn light, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been trying to warn me, not about falling, but about trusting too long. Around noon, the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but local. It was Justin. His voice came through the line thin and uneven, like it was being dragged across gravel. "Gee, listen, don't talk to the cops, okay? It's all a misunderstanding." I asked where he was. "Doesn't matter," he said quickly. "I just need to explain. I didn't mean for you to get hurt." I told him I knew that I believed him, though I wasn't sure I did. "They think I tried to rob you," he said. "But it wasn't like that. I just needed time." I asked what he needed time for. Silence stretched. Then he said, "There are people who lent me money. Bad people. They said if I didn't pay, they'd come after family. I was trying to protect you." The absurdity of it made me laugh, which hurt my ribs. "By pushing me down the stairs?" I asked softly. He didn't answer. Then he said, "I saw the cops at the station. They know everything. You have to tell them it was an accident." I told him I couldn't lie. His breath caught on the other end. "You'd really let them put me away?" he asked, and in his voice I heard the old child again, the one who used to cling to my leg when the thunder started. "I don't want that," I said, "but I want you to stop before you can't come back." He cursed under his breath, a word sharp enough to cut the line, and then the call ended. I tried to call back, but the number was already disconnected. For the next few days, rumors began to ripple through the small town the way they always do. Half facts, half inventions. The cashier at the corner store gave me that careful smile people reserve for tragedy. At the VFW hall, Sam asked whether it was true. My grandson had been mixed up with the wrong crowd. I said I didn't know. He said he'd heard the police found him sleeping in an abandoned car by the river, that there were drugs involved, that he might be cooperating now. I thanked him and left before the conversation could turn into condolences. Each night I sat by the phone, half hoping Justin would call again, half fearing he would. The detective rang once more to confirm they had picked him up for questioning. He wouldn't say more, only that they were sorting things out. I imagined the scene, the boy in the small room, the metal table, the fluorescent hum, the weight of silence. I pictured him trying to charm his way out, his easy smile faltering when it didn't work. I wanted to drive to the station, to look him in the eye and ask why. But the truth was, I already knew the answer. Because he could. Because I was there. Because somewhere between the child I adored and the man he had become, the line between need and entitlement had blurred beyond recognition. The following week, Daniel called for the first time in months. His voice was tight with exhaustion and guilt. "Dad, what the hell happened?" he asked. I told him what little I could, though it sounded even thinner when spoken aloud. He swore under his breath. "He's just a kid," he said. "He screws up. We all did." I wanted to shout that I never shoved my father down a flight of stairs, but I bit my tongue. He said he'd come by that weekend, that we'd talk in person. When Saturday arrived, he stood in my doorway, looking smaller than I remembered, his hair flecked with gray. "They're saying he's looking at charges," he said. "They'll ruin him." I told him Justin had ruined himself. He sat at the table, rubbing his temples. "He said you wouldn't help him, that you humiliated him." I laughed, bitter and hollow. "By saying no?" Daniel looked up, eyes red. "You don't understand what it's like now. Kids get into holes you can't climb out of. One bad debt, one wrong text, and it's over." He was scared. I said fear didn't justify cruelty. He said I was being self-righteous. For a while we just stared at each other, two men separated by decades and disappointment. Then he said quietly, "He always thought you didn't think he'd amount to anything." I wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that I'd loved the boy more fiercely than he could imagine, but the words caught somewhere behind my ribs. "Then he should have tried to prove me wrong," I said instead. Daniel stood, muttering that I'd never forgive anyone for being human. When he left, I heard his car linger at the curb, engine idling, before it finally drove away. After that visit, the silence returned heavier than before. The neighbors kept their distance, not out of cruelty, but out of uncertainty. People fear contamination from other people's shame. I moved slower around the house, checking locks twice, then 3 times. The bruises on my side turned yellow, my wrist itched under the cast. And each night I replayed the moment at the top of the stairs, wondering whether there had been hesitation in his eyes. Sometimes I convinced myself there had, that maybe he had regretted it even as he did it. Other times I saw only the cold calculation of a boy who had stopped believing the world owed him kindness. I started writing letters to Eleanor in a notebook I kept on the nightstand, telling her everything as if she were just away visiting her sister again. I told her I was fine, that the house was safe, that Justin had made a mistake, but maybe there was still hope. The act of writing steadied me, though I knew no one would ever read it. One evening, as I finished a page, The phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have talked to them, G. They're making it worse." I stared at it until the screen went dark. When I called back, there was no answer. A week later, Detective Ferris called to say the investigation was ongoing, but they had evidence suggesting Justin might have been involved with others targeting elderly relatives for money. Small-time scams, coercion, nothing organized but dangerous all the same. "He's not the only one," Ferris said. "There's a pattern. Kids taking advantage of trust." His tone was almost apologetic, as if he were reporting a natural disaster rather than a crime. When I hung up, I sat in the quiet for a long time, letting the words settle. The betrayal no longer felt personal. It felt generational, like a sickness spreading quietly through families. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. The maple had lost all its leaves, its bare branches clawing at the gray sky. The air smelled of snow. Somewhere, in some holding cell or back alley, my grandson was telling himself another story about how none of this was his fault. And I, standing in the house I had built with my own hands, was telling myself one too, that maybe falling was not the worst thing that could happen to a man, but staying down after someone you love had pushed you. That was a different kind of death. The middle of December brought a kind of silence that felt almost deliberate, as if the whole world had decided to step back and watch me from a distance. The days grew short and heavy, the sun nothing more than a dull coin rolling along the horizon, and the house began to take on the stale smell of boiled potatoes and old paper. I told myself it was just the season, but it wasn't the cold that made me keep the curtains drawn. It was the eyes I imagined behind every window, the whispers that bloomed whenever I stepped outside to collect the mail. People in towns like ours love a story, and mine had become one, passed from porch to porch, the details bending each time until it sounded like a parable about greed or madness, or the inevitable betrayal of blood. Some said my grandson had come to rob me blind. Others said I'd framed him out of pride. The truth was smaller and meaner than either version. A boy's panic and an old man's failure to see it coming. The detective stopped calling for updates, which I took as a sign they either had what they needed or had given up. I went about my days in slow loops, kettle, pills, porch, the same small orbit around the emptiness that followed me from room to room. My wrist healed crooked, and the doctor said I should start exercises to loosen it. But the idea of holding anything heavier than a coffee cup made me tired. I was halfway through one of those afternoons, television murmuring in the background, a crossword half finished, when the phone rang again. It was a number I didn't know, but something in me already recognized it. Justin's voice was quieter this time, almost calm. "Gee," he said, "they let me go." My heart lurched before my mind could catch up. "On bail?" I asked. "Yeah, something like that," he said. "They didn't have proof, just those camera shots. Dad helped." I imagined Daniel signing papers, paying bonds, making deals he couldn't afford. "I'm getting my life together," Justin went on. "I swear it. I just need to come by, pick up some things." I told him there was nothing here for him, but he insisted. "You kept some stuff, right? My old backpack, maybe a jacket. I don't want any money, just my things." I should have said no. I should have told him to talk to his father, to meet at a cafe or the station, anywhere but here. But the truth is, when you lose faith in someone you love, part of you still keeps a light burning in the window, a foolish hope that they'll see it and come home different. I told him to come the next day, in daylight. When I hung up, I sat for a long time with the phone in my lap, the old ache in my chest returning. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't tell the detective. I wanted for once to handle something in this family without turning it into a case file. The next day dawned brittle and pale. The maple outside stood bare against a colorless sky, its branches holding a thin frosting of ice that looked beautiful and dangerous at once. I spent the morning cleaning the house. Not that it was dirty, but I needed to do something with my hands. I swept the stairs where the accident had happened, each stroke of the broom releasing faint traces of dust and memory. I straightened the photographs on the mantel, the ones Eleanor had insisted we keep, even when Daniel said nobody printed pictures anymore. There was one of Justin as a toddler, chubby cheeks, eyes wide with a kind of joy that now felt like a cruel joke. I kept looking at that photo as if it could explain what had gone wrong. He arrived just after noon. I saw his shape through the frosted glass before he knocked. A little thinner, hair longer, his hoodie zipped to the chin. When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was how young he looked again. It startled me. "Hey, G," he said softly. "You look good." I wanted to laugh at that. I looked like a scarecrow held together with tape. "Come in," I said, and stepped aside. He crossed the threshold slowly, as if unsure whether the house would let him in. The air between us was full of static, the kind that makes you want to say something kind, just to fill it. He looked around, his eyes flicking to the bowl where I kept my keys, the side table where the mail stacked up, the corner where my cane leaned against the wall. I told myself I was imagining it, that he was just nervous. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where it had all begun. I poured him coffee, and he actually drank it this time, though his hands trembled slightly. "They said you weren't pressing charges," he said. "That true?" I told him I hadn't made that decision yet, that the police were handling it. He nodded, eyes down. "I don't blame you," he murmured. "I messed up. I was scared. I didn't know what I was doing." The words came rehearsed, too neat, but I wanted to believe them anyway. I asked if he had a place to stay. He said he was crashing with friends, that things were fine, but his tone carried the hollow weight of someone reciting lines for a part he didn't want to play. Then, without warning, his face changed. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and his voice dropped. "You told them I pushed you." It wasn't a question. I didn't answer at first. "I told them what happened," I said finally. "You think that's fair?" He shot back. "You think you remember it right? You were half out of it. You fell, G. You always said those stairs were a death trap." I stared at him, stunned by how easily he'd rewritten the story. "You're saying I imagined it?" I asked. He shrugged. "I'm saying things got messy. People fall." He looked at me then with a strange intensity, something between defiance and pleading. "You could fix this, you know. Just tell them you slipped. Then it's over. We can forget it." There are moments in life when you hear two voices inside you, the one that wants peace at any cost, and the one that still believes in the truth. I heard both then, loud as thunder. I could have lied, ended it, spared him, but the image of Eleanor rose in my mind, her voice steady and unyielding. "Don't let love turn you into a fool." I told him I couldn't. His expression hardened. "They'll send me away, G. I'm not built for that." I said he should have thought of that sooner. The words came out colder than I intended, and I saw them hit him like a slap. He stood up abruptly, knocking the chair back. "You think you're so perfect," he said, pacing now. "You think you never made mistakes. You don't know what it's like now. Everything costs. Everything's stacked against us. You sit here in your paid-off house judging." I wanted to say I wasn't judging, that I just wanted him safe, that I would forgive anything if he'd only tell the truth. But the air was too thick with anger for words to land. He stopped pacing and leaned on the counter, breathing hard. "You think I wanted to hurt you?" he said finally, almost whispering. "You think I planned it? You were yelling. I was scared. It just happened." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. He rubbed his face with both hands and sank into the chair again. For a moment we sat in a silence that felt almost tender, like two men catching their breath after a long fight. Then he said, "Can I use your bathroom?" And I nodded. While he was gone, I sat staring at the table, trying to slow the storm in my chest. When he didn't return after a few minutes, I called his name. No answer. I stood carefully, my ribs aching, and walked toward the hall. The bathroom door was open. The light was off. The hallway beyond was empty. Panic tightened in my throat. I moved faster than I should have. Through the living room. Past the stairs. The front door was still closed, but the door to the study, the one where I kept my small safe, was ajar. I pushed it open. The safe sat half pulled from the wall, the combination dial smeared with fingerprints. My heart dropped. "Justin!" I called again. From somewhere above, a floorboard creaked. I looked up and saw him at the top of the stairs, the same place as before, holding something small in his hand. My spare debit card, the one I kept hidden behind a stack of old tax papers. "You shouldn't have left it there," he said quietly. For a long second, neither of us moved. The memory of the fall washed through me so vividly I could taste the metal of blood in my mouth again. "Put it down," I said. He didn't. "I just need to borrow it," he said, voice shaking. "Please, G, I'll bring it back." I told him it wasn't about the money, that he was destroying what little trust we had left. He laughed bitterly. "Trust doesn't pay bills," he said. "You've got everything, and you don't even use it." I took a slow step forward, and he flinched, backing away. "Don't," he said sharply. His knuckles were white around the card. Then, as quickly as it had started, something broke in him. He threw the card down, the plastic clattering against the wood, and sank to the floor, head in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said over and over, the words muffled by his palms. "I don't know why I do this." I picked up the card and slipped it into my pocket. For the first time I saw not the criminal or the addict, but the frightened child I'd once carried on my shoulders at the county fair. I wanted to kneel beside him, to touch his shoulder, but fear held me still. "You have to go," I said softly. "You can't come back until you're ready to tell the truth." He looked up, eyes rimmed with tears, anger replaced by something like despair. "You really mean that?" he asked. I nodded. He stood slowly, wiped his face, and walked past me down the stairs, without another word. The front door opened, closed, and the house fell into a silence so deep I could hear the tick of the clock in the next room. That night, I couldn't stop replaying it. The way he'd looked at me before leaving, like a man walking off the edge of something he couldn't see the bottom of. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell anyone. I just sat in the dark until the first light of morning stretched across the floorboards. When I finally rose, I noticed the safe was still half open. Inside, the envelopes were untouched, but on top of them lay a folded piece of paper. My name was written across it in Justin's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. "I didn't mean to hurt you," it read. "But you don't know what I've done. If they find out, it's over. I love you. I'm sorry." No signature, no explanation. Just that. I read it again and again until the letters blurred. For the first time since that night, I felt the real shape of the fear beneath everything, not just for what he had done, but for what might still be coming. The middle of a story is supposed to offer some glimpse of what's next, some turning point that promises either hope or ruin. That morning, standing in the half-light of my study with that note trembling in my hands, I realized it would be both. January dragged itself into the calendar with a brittle stubbornness, the kind of cold that makes doors swell and knees ache and tempers fray. And in that hard light, the story that had been a private wound started to become a public problem. A woman from Adult Protective Services called first, her voice professionally gentle, informing me that a report had been filed expressing concern about my financial well-being and decision-making capacity. Phrases that make a man feel like he's already been moved from the driver's seat to the trunk. She said they had to follow up, nothing personal, and asked if she could stop by to make sure I had groceries, heat, and supports. When she arrived, she was younger than I expected, eyes quick, notebook open before she crossed the threshold. She looked in my fridge and nodded at the neatly labeled leftovers like they were witnesses on my behalf, asked about my medications, asked who helped me with bills. When I said I handled them myself, she cocked her head and asked how I kept track. I showed her the ledger, the neat columns, the ruler straight lines. She smiled and said not many people my age keep a ledger anymore. I told her the trick to staying upright was refusing to hand your balance to someone else's idea of convenience. She closed the notebook and, softer now, said that sometimes these reports came from family who were trying to help in clumsy ways. I knew then, without asking, that Daniel had tried to build a paper wall between me and the charges his son might face, and I felt the old mixture of love and anger bloom in my chest. Love for a boy I'd raised who still believed problems could be managed by rearranging the truth. Anger that his rearrangements always seemed to put me at the edge of a cliff. 2 days later, Detective Ferris returned, not to talk about pressing charges, but because the case had widened. The gas station footage that put Justin at the ATM had led them to another video, this one from a pharmacy where a woman in a puffer jacket bought prepaid cards with cash and left in a car registered to a name I didn't recognize. The plates tied back to a rental paid for by a boy who went to high school with Justin and who, according to the detective's patient, tired voice, was now cooperating. What he was cooperating about was a little ring of small-time schemes that sounded almost childish until you added up the hurt. Convincing an aunt to hold a check for someone, borrowing a card for gas, and using it 4 times, setting up a fake GoFundMe for a cousin's surgery. The kinds of tricks that rely on love like a burglar relies on an unlocked window. In the middle of it, like the knot in a cheap rope, sat my grandson. Not the mastermind, Ferris said, but the kid willing to knock on the door because he knew the voice on the other side would open it. When Ferris finished laying out these facts in his low, tired way, he set down his pen and asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I'd noticed any odd calls recently. I told him about the blocked numbers, the hang-ups, the text that said I was making it worse. He took my phone, thumbed through the settings, and turned on a feature I didn't know existed that would send suspicious messages to a folder with a name that sounded like a sheriff's drawer. I started checking the porch camera again, even though I hated it, the screen both comfort and accusation. One afternoon, the footage showed Justin not at my door, but across the street, leaning against a lamppost, pretending to check his phone, while his gaze kept coming back to my house like the tide. He didn't knock. He just watched and left, and the not knocking hurt in a new way. A kind of siege I didn't know how to name. The next morning I found a scuff on the back door latch. Not damage, more like a rehearsal. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself a lot of things. I moved the small safe from the study closet to the locked trunk of the old car in the garage. Not because there was anything in it worth a heist, but because ritual is the only kind of armor a man can put on when the threats are ghosts. I changed what passwords I knew how to change, which is to say the easy ones, and wrote the new codes on an index card that I hid where Eleanor used to hide birthday presents, behind the rolled linens at the top of the hallway closet, secure in the belief that thieves rarely look among neatly folded towels. That night, trying to sleep, I heard a soft chirp like an insect and traced it to the underside of the porch light fixture. There, stuck in place with a dot of chewing gum, like the work of a bored teenager, was a little black puck I didn't recognize. I pried it off with a butter knife and turned it in my fingers until it buzzed again and flashed a pinprick of blue. When Ferris came by to collect it the next morning, he called it a tracker. Cheap. Nothing a professional would use. The kind of thing kids order because it feels like the movies. He asked if I'd be willing to let them put it back wired to a notification system so they could see who checked it. I said yes, and for the first time since the fall, I felt a thin wire of steel tighten inside me. Not vengeance exactly, but a refusal to be merely the scene of the crime. The social worker returned with a colleague, and this time their questions were less about casseroles and more about competence. Could I name the president, the date, the address of my house? Could I remember 3 objects after a minute? Could I count backward by 7s without losing track? I played along, smiling when they did, not because I enjoyed the test, but because I could feel the trap being set somewhere else, and I wanted to make sure the door would not close. At the end, the younger one, Maya, I'd learned, said she had also spoken with my son, who was understandably worried, and that sometimes families in stressful circumstances petitioned for conservatorships as temporary supports. The talk was wrapped in cotton, but the blade was visible. Move my money out of my reach under the banner of care, and the whole case could be reframed as a misunderstanding among people who only wanted what was best. I thanked her for her concern. I asked whether the person who filed the report had mentioned the hospital wrist brace, or the police alert on my account, or the bruise in the shape of a stair edge. She said she couldn't share the contents of the report, but her eyes flickered, which was answer enough. When she and her colleague left, I sat at the table with Eleanor's mug and let the rage sit beside me, not boiling this time, just steady, like a pilot light that refuses to blow out. The next blow came from a direction I was too old to anticipate. Sam from the VFW knocked with his hat in his hands and an expression like a man carrying bad weather. He said a buddy's granddaughter had shown him something on a private account online, a second profile that belonged to my grandson, not the one with the smiling vacation photos and graduation posts, but the one kids use when they want to be admired by a different audience. In it, there were jokes about Grandpa Banks, a blurry video shot inside someone's kitchen with a voice braying off camera about soft targets, and a list that could have been a meme if it weren't so specific. 1. Get PIN 2. ATM 3. Cash out. 4. Ghost. My name wasn't in it, but the wallpaper in the background of one clip was mine. The faded blue pattern Eleanor picked out after we could finally afford something nicer than paint. I felt something cold flood me that had nothing to do with the Midwestern winter. I asked Sam to send it to Detective Ferris, and then, after he left, I sat very still until the light changed. It wasn't just that Justin had plotted or boasted or performed. It was that he had memorialized the planning like a souvenir, as if his own shame couldn't be trusted to remember and needed a highlight reel. There is a kind of grief that has no tears in it, only a slow, steady grinding down of what you thought was bedrock. Daniel called again, not to apologize or to ask after my ribs, but to inform me that his lawyer had advised them to pursue a guardianship temporarily, so that we can keep the state out of it. He said the words kindly, as if he were suggesting a new brand of oatmeal, but beneath the calm, I heard the desperation of a father fraying at the edges. I asked him whether he had seen the videos. He said kids post stupid things. It didn't mean anything. I asked whether the tracker under my porch light meant anything. He said his son was being smeared by the same people who were trying to throw him in prison. I said the people trying to put him in prison were responding to choices he'd made. There was a long silence, and then he said the one thing that could still cut me. You've always been better at accounting than compassion. It was so unfair I laughed, not kindly. Eleanor had called me relentless with numbers and soft with people, and to have my own son rewrite me into the opposite felt like a theft more intimate than anything that had passed through an ATM. When he hung up, I realized my hands were shaking, not from fear this time, but from the effort of holding a line I had drawn for a boy who used to fall asleep with his head in my lap during Sunday football. If the first wave of bruises was to the body, the second wave came for the parts of a man no one can see. Anonymous notes began showing up in my mailbox, not threats, just snotty little sermons scribbled on torn envelopes about family business and forgiving blood. Someone taped a photocopied article to my porch railing about elder loneliness and suicide rates like a curse disguised as a PSA. One night my doorbell rang after midnight, and when I checked the camera, the porch was empty except for a small brown bag, the kind they give you at the pharmacy. Inside was a burner phone with no contacts, its screen lit by a single text. "We can fix this privately. Don't answer cops." I turned it over to Ferris, who raised his eyebrows and said someone had learned exactly enough about criminal procedure from television to make everything worse. He asked whether I had noticed any new faces on the block. I told him the block had fewer faces than it used to. The winter pushed everyone indoors except the teenagers, who wore the cold like a badge. He said they had traced the tracker purchase to a big box store and were working with the manager to pull receipts. All the patient machinery of civic order grinding away, while I made tea and boiled eggs and tried not to imagine my grandson's world collapsing in increments. The most humiliating blow, though, came quietly on a Thursday morning when the bank called to ask me to verify an audio authorization I'd supposedly given the night before. A woman in fraud prevention with a cheerful voice played me a recording. My name, my address, the last 4 digits of my social, and then a thin approximation of my voice, authorizing a transfer from savings to checking and requesting a temporary lift of daily ATM limits. The words were mine. The warmth was not. The pauses were wrong, like an actor's in a community play. And if you loved me, you would have known it wasn't me. But to a stranger, it sounded passable enough to flag as suspicious rather than slam the door. The woman asked whether I had recently changed phones or traveled. I said no, and felt foolish for being so grateful to a stranger for doing her job. When I hung up, I stared at my reflection in the dark screen of the unplugged television and tried to reconcile the old man in the glass with the digital mass that had briefly wandered around town, pretending to be me. Later, Ferris would tell me kids can buy software for a month's streaming subscription that can make anyone sound like anyone if you feed it enough voicemails, and that he had 2 other cases where grandsons had called pretending to be a bank manager and a Medicare rep, each time with a voice wearing a grandfather's cadence, like a stolen coat. I sat with that a long time, and for the first time since the hospital, I cried, quietly, because there is something particularly indecent about having the sound of your care twisted into a tool. The day after the fake authorization attempt, Maya from APS returned one more time. Notepad closed this time, hands empty. She said she had completed her report and that it reflected that I was competent, that my home was safe, that any attempt to place me under conservatorship without cause would be inappropriate. The word sounded like a gavel in miniature. She asked whether I had support beyond the frozen lake of this town's gossip, whether I had people. I said widowers have people until about the end of the service. And then the casserole train slows, and the phone stops ringing, because no one knows what to do with grief that doesn't schedule itself. She said there was a group that met on Tuesdays at the library for older adults to talk about financial boundary setting, which sounded like a pamphlet trying very hard not to use the word theft. I said I might go. She put her hand on the table, not touching mine, leaving it there like a bridge in case I wanted to cross. I didn't, but I was grateful to see it. That night, after the house settled and the furnace made the old polite cough it makes before it sleeps, the phone rang from a number I knew would be him, because shame always dials late. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't apologize. He launched straight into the frantic rhythm of a boy with a timer running somewhere out of sight, saying things like, "This is the last time, and they're going to make me pay double. And if you loved me, you'd help me fix it." I told him love wasn't a locksmith for bad doors. He told me I was choosing strangers over family. I told him I was choosing the part of him that could still look at himself in a mirror when he was 30. He said mirrors were for people who had time. Then softer, he said he had told some people that I would help, that he had promised, that they would be angry if I made him a liar. The words chilled me, not because they were a threat, but because I heard in them the same boy who used to promise favors at school and bring home the broken pieces for someone else to fix. I asked him whether he had watched the videos he'd posted, whether he had looked at himself and recognized the person there. He hung up. In the dead center of that winter, the humiliation, the petitions, the trackers, the fake voices, the anonymous notes, all of it braided into a rope that looped around my days. And the worst part of it was not the fear or the anger, but the numb practicality that settled in like a tenant. I kept lists, changed the porch bulb, moved the safe, call the bank, text the detective the new number, call Daniel back and refuse to argue, set a second kettle on in case someone visits, and you need to look like a man who has not been reduced to a single narrow hallway of thought. I began, without naming it out loud, to prepare for the moment when compassion would no longer be the same thing as kindness, when telling the truth in a room would mean my grandson would not come home for a while. On a Sunday afternoon, when the light looks like surrender, I went up to the attic to bring down the better blankets and found, tucked behind a box of Eleanor's church hats, a small spiral notebook I did not own. The first pages were doodles and scribbles a child might make to look busy. The next were lists, names with dollar amounts, arrows pointing to dates, little notes in a cramped hand. Ask about safe? Card and leather thing? Pin, maybe 1948? Don't let him call. It was not a ledger, but it was close enough to make the room tilt. I sat on the dusty floorboards and turned the pages slowly, the air stale with insulation and old wood, and I understood, with a clarity that left no oxygen for denial, that this was no accident and no single gesture of panic at the top of the stairs. It was a plan, a shabby one, but a plan just the same, rehearsed across my rooms and my routines, and I was the stage. I carried the notebook downstairs like a relic and set it beside Eleanor's mug on the table. For a long time, I didn't move. Then I called Detective Ferris and told him I was ready to do whatever came next, not because I wanted punishment or because I had finally run out of love, but because the love I had left needed to be aimed at the part of the boy that might yet survive the man he was becoming. He said he would come in the morning to collect the notebook and talk through the next steps. Before I went to bed, I opened the old ledger and wrote one more line at the bottom of a clean page, not a number this time, but a sentence that felt like an oath. Compassion is not the absence of consequence. Then I turned off the light and slept, for the first time in weeks, without dreaming of stairs. The morning of the arrest began without drama, and perhaps that was the strangest mercy of all. It was a Thursday, mild for February, the kind of morning that fools you into believing winter has decided to forgive. I woke early, brewed coffee, and for the first time in weeks I didn't check the porch camera. The house smelled faintly of cedar from the cleaner I'd used on the floors the night before, and the air held a kind of waiting stillness, as if the walls themselves had chosen to listen. Detective Ferris was due at 9 to collect the notebook from the attic, and I had laid it out on the table beside Eleanor's mug, the cover speckled with dust, the corners softened by use. I'd read it twice more since finding it, and both times it made me dizzy. The mixture of childish scribbles and predatory precision, the notes about my routines written in the same scrawl that had once signed birthday cards with Love You G in green marker. It felt almost holy in its desecration, an artifact from a ruined faith. Ferris arrived on time, wearing the same gray coat that had begun to look like a uniform of resignation. He shook my hand, thanked me for cooperating, and asked whether I'd touched anything else upstairs. I said no. He flipped through the notebook silently, occasionally making a small sound in his throat. Half pity, half disbelief. "It's enough," he said finally. "More than enough. We'll bring him in today." I nodded, the words washing over me like a weather report. He paused at the door, hesitating in that way people do when they're not sure if comfort is appropriate. "You're doing the right thing," he said. I told him right things don't feel this heavy. He didn't argue. After he left, I tried to busy myself with chores, washing the dishes, straightening the cushions, small rituals of normal life. But each motion felt like a rehearsal for an ending. Around noon, the phone rang. The caller ID said, "Private number," and before I even answered, I knew it would be him. "Gee," Justin said, his voice tight and frantic. "I need you to listen, okay? Don't hang up." I sat down slowly, the ache in my ribs pulsing like an old bell. "You shouldn't be calling me," I said. "They're looking for you." "I know," he snapped. "I know. But they're saying crazy things. They found that stupid notebook. It's not what it looks like. You can tell them that, right? You can tell them it's nothing." I asked him where he was. "Doesn't matter," he said. "You just have to call that cop. Tell him you made a mistake. Say I came to see you, but we worked it out. Please, G, I'm begging you. They're saying I'm some kind of ringleader. You know me." I closed my eyes. I did know him, or thought I had. The boy who once hid a baby bird in his room for 3 days because he couldn't stand the thought of it dying alone. The teenager who wore his grandmother's rosary during finals because he thought it might make her proud. I searched for that boy in the voice on the line, but what I heard was someone cornered, feral, ready to chew through his own name to escape. "It's not my mistake to fix," I said. There was a long silence, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone flat. "You're really going to let them lock me up? After everything?" I said quietly, "After everything, yes." The sound that came next wasn't quite a sob. It was something rawer, like an animal caught in its own trap. "You don't understand," he whispered. "They'll come for you, too. You think you're safe because you told the truth, but you're not. You think those cops care about you? You're just a story to them, a headline. Old man conned by grandson. That's all you'll ever be." Then the line went dead. For a moment, I just sat there, listening to the empty buzz of the dial tone. Then I called Ferris, told him about the call, about the threat, about the fear I didn't want to admit I still had. He said they were already en route to pick him up, that I should stay inside, lock the doors, and wait for an officer to check in. I thanked him, hung up, and went to the window. Outside, the street was pale and still. The snow on the lawns half melted into patches of dirty gray. Across the way, Ruth was scraping ice from her windshield, her red coat bright against the dull day. For a moment I envied her ignorance, her simple morning tasks unburdened by the weight of moral consequence. Then a dark sedan turned the corner and slowed in front of my house. My heart stuttered. It wasn't the police car's color, and I couldn't see the plates. The engine idled for a long minute, then the window rolled down. A hand extended, tossed something onto the curb, a small envelope, before the car eased away. I didn't move at first. Fear is funny that way. It doesn't make you run. It roots you in place until your body remembers it's alive. Finally, I stepped outside, the cold biting at my face, and picked up the envelope. My name was written on it in that same jagged scrawl. Inside was a photo, grainy, printed from a phone. It showed me at my kitchen table, bent over my ledger, the angle taken through the window. Beneath it, a single line in ink. You shouldn't have told them. My knees went weak, and I had to grip the railing to stay upright. He'd been here, maybe even that morning, watching, photographing. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat down hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. For the first time, the grief curdled into something darker, anger, hot and steady, a sense that love had been turned into a leash I'd allowed him to pull until my skin burned. When the police finally called to confirm he was in custody, there was no satisfaction, only a hollow quiet. Ferris said they'd found him hiding in a friend's basement 2 towns over, that he'd gone without a fight, that he looked tired. He said they'd discovered a laptop with records of the small frauds, the messages to his friends bragging about easy money, the videos mocking the old fools who hand it over because they still think family means something. He asked if I wanted to come in to give a final statement. I hesitated, then said yes. It felt wrong not to look him in the eye one more time. The station smelled of coffee and disinfectant. Ferris met me at the door, his expression unreadable. He led me down a hallway lined with bulletin boards, each one filled with faces that might once have been loved by someone. We stopped at a small window, the glass thick, the kind that swallows sound. Behind it sat Justin, hands cuffed, a bruise on his cheek, his hoodie traded for the institutional gray of holding. He looked up as I approached. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he smiled, a small, uncertain thing, almost shy. "Hey, G," he mouthed. I nodded. A guard stepped aside so I could speak through the intercom. "Why?" I asked, the word rough in my throat. He shrugged, eyes darting to the floor. "I don't know. It got out of control." I told him that wasn't an answer. He looked up again, and for a moment the mask slipped. "Because it was easy," he said quietly. "Because you always forgave me. Because I thought you would again." Something broke then, not just in him, but in the space between us. I realized forgiveness had become the currency he spent most freely, because it always came with interest. I leaned closer to the glass. "You pushed me," I said. "You left me there. You lied to me. You turned this house into a crime scene." His eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I swear to God I didn't mean to." "But you did," I said. "And meaning doesn't erase the doing." He pressed his forehead to the glass, the gesture oddly childlike. "I love you, G," he said. "You know that, right?" I wanted to say I loved him too, that love wasn't the question, that love and consequence could exist in the same breath. But what came out instead was, "Then prove it by being better than this." He closed his eyes. When the guard came to lead him away, he didn't look back. As I left the station, Ferris walked me to the door. "He'll probably get probation," he said. "First offense of this level, with cooperation. Maybe community service. Maybe rehab if they push for it." I nodded. "That's mercy," I said. He looked at me. "You sure you're all right with that?" I thought for a long moment. "Mercy isn't the same as forgetting," I said. "It's just another kind of remembering." That night the house felt lighter somehow, as if the air had finally exhaled. I sat by the window with the lights off, watching the snow start again, each flake catching the lamplight like falling ash. I thought about the generations of men in my family, my father who could never say sorry, me who said it too often, my son who hid behind silence, my grandson who mistook guilt for hunger. I wondered whether this was our inheritance, not money or property, but the art of misunderstanding one another until something finally broke. I thought of the boy in the cell, and the man he might still become, and I prayed, not for his release, but for his reckoning, the one that happens inside, when all the noise has stopped. Before going to bed, I went to the kitchen and took down the photo from the mantel, the one of him at 5 years old, frosting on his nose from Eleanor's last birthday cake. I held it for a long time, then slid it into a drawer. Not thrown away, not displayed, just waiting, like something unfinished. And for the first time since the fall, I allowed myself to cry without hiding it, because the hardest part of justice is that it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like survival. Spring came late that year, as if the season itself was hesitant to return to a house that had seen so much quiet grief. The snow withdrew slowly, leaving behind dull patches of grass and the faint sour smell of thawed earth. By April, the maple out front began to show new buds, small, fragile, uncertain. And I found myself standing at the window every morning, checking their progress like a man taking attendance. It had been nearly 2 months since Justin's sentencing, and though the court called it probation with supervision, to me it felt like a boundary carved into time itself. He was ordered to live with his father, attend counseling, perform community service at a local shelter, and stay away from me until the case officer approved contact. The irony wasn't lost on me, that my safety, my peace, now depended on a boy I had once held against my chest like a promise. The first week after the hearing, I woke every night at 3 a.m., as if summoned by the memory of sirens that had never come. But as the days lengthened and the air softened, the silence of the house changed its tone. It stopped accusing and started simply existing again. I began to walk more, slow loops around the block, nodding to neighbors who still looked uncertain about what to say. The world had learned to treat me like someone who had survived a small fire, respectful, cautious, curious, from a distance. Ruth brought soup once a week and left it in a covered bowl on the porch, pretending it was just neighborly kindness, though I could see pity flicker across her face when she thought I wasn't looking. At first, I resented it, but then I began to recognize that pity, too, was a kind of participation in the human contract. It meant someone still saw you. I started going to the library group Maya had mentioned, not because I needed advice on protecting my assets, but because the sound of other voices, old men mostly, telling stories of losses both financial and moral, became a kind of medicine. We were all walking evidence that heartbreak doesn't end you. It just rearranges you. One afternoon in May, I received a letter with no return address, the handwriting shaky but unmistakable. The envelope contained a single sheet of lined paper. "Hey, G, they say I can write now. I'm doing the work, like the judge said. I hate it, but I'm doing it. I think about that day every night. I wish I could take it back, but I can't. I don't expect you to forgive me yet. I just wanted you to know I'm not high anymore, and I got a job at the shelter fixing the boiler. You always said work fixes the hands before it fixes the head. I guess I'm learning that. I love you. Jay. I read it twice, then a third time, tracing each uneven letter as if it were a pulse. I didn't answer right away. I set the letter on the mantel beside Eleanor's photo and left it there for a week, maybe more, letting it absorb the air of the house, the faint smell of dust and coffee and aging wood. Then one morning, I sat down at the table with my old stationery, the kind with embossed initials she had given me for our 50th anniversary, and began to write. Justin, I got your letter. I'm glad you're working. I hope the boiler behaves. I forgive you for the act, but not yet for the ease with which you committed it. Forgiveness isn't a door you walk through once. It's a field you cross every day, and some days you make it farther than others. Keep crossing. G. After I mailed it, I didn't expect a reply, but a month later another envelope came. Inside was a photo of him at the shelter, standing beside a stack of canned goods, his expression uncertain but sober. The back of the photo said only, "Still trying." That night, I placed it in the same drawer where the old birthday picture had gone. Not out of sight, just waiting, as before. I realized then that waiting had become my quiet vocation. Waiting for trust to return, waiting for sleep that wasn't full of echoes, waiting for the moment when I could think of him without the ache pulling at my ribs like a stubborn root. Summer arrived with its warm insistence, and the maple filled out in full green. The house, for all its age, seemed to breathe again. I painted the porch railing, fixed the hinge on the back door, even replaced the old carpet on the stairs, the same stairs that had nearly killed me, with polished oak steps. It wasn't defiance, it was reclamation. I wanted that staircase to hold a new story, one of survival rather than betrayal. The first time I climbed it without gripping the railing, I found myself whispering, "See, Eleanor, still here." And for the first time in months I felt her absence as something gentle rather than raw. Sometimes, when the evening stretched long and golden, I'd sit on the porch with my ledger open, though I no longer used it for accounts. Instead, I wrote names, memories, fragments of thought. On one page I wrote, "A man spends half his life earning what the world can take and the other half learning what it can't." On another, "Justice is not punishment. It's the moment truth stops hiding." These became my small scriptures, private sermons for an old man who no longer went to church, but still believed in redemption where it could be found. In late July, Daniel called for the first time since the court date. His voice was softer than I remembered, full of exhaustion and something like remorse. He said Justin was keeping his head down, that he'd started showing up early for his shifts, that the counselor said he was trying. Then he said, "I know you think I failed him." I told him failure wasn't hereditary. It was just contagious. There was a long pause, and then he said, "He's scared to see you." I told him that was good, that fear was sometimes the first honest thing a man feels after a lie. He laughed quietly, and for the first time in years, it sounded like the boy I'd raised. Before hanging up, he said, "He'll be all right." I said, "So will I." Neither of us added, "I hope." When September came, Justin's probation officer called to ask whether I'd be open to a supervised visit. I said yes, though I wasn't sure why. The day he arrived, the air was crisp, the sky the hard blue that only comes after a storm. He stepped out of the car in a plain shirt and jeans, hair trimmed, eyes clear. For a long moment we just stood there, the distance between us heavy with all the things that couldn't be undone. Then he said, "Nice stairs," and for some reason we both laughed. It wasn't forgiveness, not really. It was recognition, the fragile start of something that might one day deserve the name. That evening, after he'd gone, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and sat by the window. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, full instead of empty. The maple leaves outside had begun to turn gold at the edges, and in their slow transformation I saw something I hadn't been brave enough to name before. The understanding that love, like grief, doesn't end. It just changes its weather. I took out the ledger one last time and wrote the final line it would ever hold. Sometimes justice is the way love teaches us to stay honest. Then I closed it, set it beside Eleanor's picture, and let the house fall into its soft, forgiving silence.